You're listening to Sweet Talk, all things maple. Welcome back to Sweet Talk. I'm your host, Adam Wild, and joining me today from the Walnut Forest is my co-host, Aaron Whiteman. Hello, Aaron.
Hi, Adam. It's great to be back in the studio, although if I look outside, I see the sun is shining, and it sure would be good to be working in the sugar bush today.
Yeah, it is always nice to be out in the woods, during these warm summer months, and we don't have snow on the ground. But it's also nice during this time of the year to take a break from maple and kind of think about other things as well.
So today we're going to stray away from our usual maple talk and instead talk about alternative tree syrups.
That's right. And when we talk about alternative tree syrups, we're referring to syrups made from the sap of other trees such as birch or beech or walnut. And these trees are typically tapped to collect sap and then concentrated to make syrup like we would with maple. And you and I both see a lot of value in alternative tree syrups as it allows us to diversify our product offerings and utilize some of the same equipment for more than just maple.
That's true. If we can use what we think of as specialized maple equipment, things like evaporators, ROs, and vacuum pumps, to make another product, then we're getting a better return on our investment in that equipment. And we all know that equipment isn't real cheap. So for this episode, we're specifically going to talk about tapping walnut trees for syrup production.
I recently had the opportunity to host Dr. Mike Rechlin at the Uihlein Forest to sit down and talk about his work tapping walnut trees down in West Virginia.
Great, let's have a listen.
So today I'm here with Dr. Mike Rechlin, who is the Maple Commodities Specialist at Future Generations University in West Virginia. Hello, Mike. Welcome to Sweet Talk. It's so great to have you here. So, usually we talk about maple, but being in West Virginia, you have a lot of walnut trees down there, and you're doing a lot of great and interesting research and information on walnut trees. So I just wanted to start out and asking you, when is the season for walnut sap flow? When do you collect walnut sap?
We're collecting walnut sap basically at the same season as maple sap, okay? Now, maple sap runs due to stem pressure. Birch sap, as you know, runs due to root pressure. And the research has shown, some research in France has shown that walnut exhibits both stem pressure and root pressure. So we have had sap flow events outside of the normal maple season, early in the fall or later in the spring, as you would see with birch, particularly later in the spring. But at this point, the commercial season, when it's practical for someone to collect and boil down walnut sap, is at the same time as the maple sap flow season, using that stem pressure.
Neat. So the best time for the walnut for the best production is kind of when you are using that stem pressure. So the freeze-thaw cycles are important for walnut sap flow.
That's correct.
Yeah. And when you are collecting the sap, what is that sap like? What is the sugar level? Is it much like maple sap?
Yeah, we find the sugar level is pretty much like maple sap for our area down in the more southerly states. And that's, anywhere from 1.4 to 1.8% sugar. Our sap tends to be less sweet than your sap up north.
And how much sap are you getting from a tree usually on average from a walnut tree? Does that compare to maple at all?
No, not at all. And that's the catch, is we get about 1/10 as much sap per season from a walnut tree as you would expect in a maple tree. We get a season, you'll get 2 gallons of sap from a tree, whereas in maple, you expect to get at least 20.
That's a big difference.
It is. And I think it's probably closely related to the sapwood. Maple has a lot of sapwood, and walnut just has a thin sapwood band around the outer reaches of the tree's diameter.
Are there any processing challenges that you may have to deal with?
Yeah, the big bugaboo with walnut syrup production is that the sap has a high concentration of what we're calling and presumed to be pectin. Call it pectin because it basically turns the sap into a jelly-like substance, usually a thin jelly-like substance. So that becomes a processing issue. It traditionally been a processing issue when running it through a reverse osmosis unit to concentrate the sugars in the sap. And it's also a processing issue when you try to run it through a filter press. It clogs the press really quickly.
Do you see that jelly-like substance even when you're boiling, like in the pans? Do you notice it coming kind of right on the edges of the pans?
Yes, you do. And a colleague of mine, Kate Photos, refers to it as you start to see the jellyfish floating in the sap, boiling sap.
I don't know if that sounds good or not, but it's interesting.
It's an interesting observation and comparison there.
Yep. Yeah. And you're boiling it on a traditional flat pan kind of evaporator style?
No, drop flue. We're using drop flue evaporators, a standard maple evaporator to boil the sap.
Okay. Does the pectin, does that influence the finish density at all?
Well, we're using a hydrometer, bringing up to 66 bricks. Okay. So I'm going to say it doesn't, but maybe that's a good question. Are we getting an artificial float on that hydrometer because of the pectin? Good question. Something to look at.
Yeah, just thinking whether that kind of increases some density in there. Because we look at like the birch syrup that I make and some work that Abby Vandenberg has done, a UVM on birch that, we try to take it to 66, 67% bricks with a hydrometer. But when she actually looked at the amount of actual sugars in there, it was more down like 50, 54% because there were so many minerals and other compounds because we have to concentrate that so much.
Okay, that's interesting. I did not know that. Procter and the maple world have been researching sap and syrup production for maple trees for over 50 years. There's been very little research done on walnut. So I'm encouraging other academic institutions, research institutions to get into the game here. We've got so much to learn, and there are so many questions that need answering.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And I'm glad that you're doing the research because you have a lot of walnuts in West Virginia, right? And, my predecessor, Mike Farrell, did some walnut research here at the Uihlein Forest a number of years ago, but he wasn't actually doing it here. He was going down to central New York where there are some more walnuts growing. So it's great to have you doing it where you have an abundance of walnuts.
We see a possibility of developing a walnut sap and syrup industry in West Virginia. I think that, West Virginia will never really compete with the Northeast when it comes to maple. You've got maple trees, you've got the technology, you've got people into doing it. We're doing well with maple down in West Virginia, but we've got a lot more walnut trees in the Northeast and can see if the markets continue to develop that some of our farmers down there could easily get into the walnut business. And we have that happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really great, and it's important to utilize what you have available in your area. So are the trees that you're tapping or others in West Virginia are actually tapping more on a commercial scale? Are they kind of native plants that are growing in maybe a forested habitat, or are these trees that have been put out in plantations and old fields or something like that? Because I know that is a common tree that people will oftentimes plant into a plantation layout.
All the work that we've done is with native walnut trees. And it's interesting, you look at the silvics of walnut trees and they talk about them being a bottomland species, rich, diverse forest in the bottom of the river valleys. Our walnut trees that we're working with tend to be hillside trees. They tend to be old fields that have repopulated with walnuts, primarily, I believe, because of the forgetful squirrels putting the seeds out or the nuts out there, not remembering where they put them. So we've got pure stands of walnut growing on ridge tops and on hillsides, places you wouldn't really expect to see them. And they're not the classic walnut veneer logs of a tall river bottom high site index species, but they tend to be shorter, good for sap production, full crowns because they're grown in old fields, open grown. So it's a little different than one might expect.
And what are the species that you're tapping? I mean, are these the black walnut, or are you also doing butternut or any other walnut species?
Because of the prevalence of black walnut on our landscape, it's black walnut that we're looking at commercially. From a research perspective, we have also tapped some white walnut or some butternut, but we don't have that many that it would ever make a viable industry.
And you hit on the timber kind of nice veneer logs, and that I think has been some pushback for people tapping walnut trees, is thinking that, that tree is going to have a lot more value if we save it and make it into a nice veneer log that's used for, furniture or whatever. What is your argument, or is that true that by tapping that walnut tree, and there's people say that same argument for maple, right? But does that hold true for walnut at all, where maple, it doesn't always hold true?
What I tell people is if you've got a nice veneer walnut log that is high value, and right now they can be very high value, don't drill a hole in it. But not all trees in your forest are going to look like that. The majority of them, particularly on these hillside settings, are going to be some twisted, some branches down low, creating knots in the wood. And I tell people to tap those trees, let your veneer logs grow. Now, when I say that, okay, if you've got a nice walnut saw log and what you're really looking for there is that dark heartwood, I don't have any trouble drilling a hole in the light sapwood because it's going to come off in the slab on the outside. So it kind of depends on your situation there.
Okay, so it really is going to depend on a tree-to-tree basis. So maybe on the beautiful, tall, straight trees, leave them. But it's really what most people want is that nice dark heartwood where we're tapping just really into that sapwood, right? And so I think I'd mentioned that the sapwood's usually not as big on a walnut tree. So what's the depth that you recommend tapping into? Or have you experimented with different tapping depths?
Yeah, there was some work done out of Kansas State that showed the best indicator of quantity of sap flow is the thickness of the sapwood. Where in maple, it's the basal area. Large basal area tree is going to give you more sap, not necessarily so in walnut. And so we have been playing around with tapping young trees, older trees, but the work in Kansas State showed that it's the depth of the sapwood. And so we're recommending that you sever through the sapwood. There's no reason to get to the heartwood. There's no sap there. So it's dead wood. But right now, because of the thickness of the bark, we're setting our drills at 2.5 inches, which will give you about a 2-inch depth of a tap hole. And that's in general. Our sapwood in walnut varies from anywhere from 1.5 inches to 3 inches. And it's pretty much a factor of the growth of the tree. It's genetically set. And in our area, we get 11 to 13 sapwood rings before the inner ring turns into heartwood. And so a fast-growing tree could have a thicker sapwood ring than a slow-growing tree. So again, you kind of got to know your forest and you got to set it up that way. But in our woods-grown walnuts that most of our producers are working with, and you can't do this individually by tree, you've got to have a standard. We're telling people to drill 2 inches into the wood.
Okay. And that growth rate probably depends on, the region. And so in West Virginia, you have a lot longer growing season than what I have up in Lake Placid, right? Not that I have too many walnut trees growing here, but there are a few around.
Absolutely.
I think I read recently in an article that you're working on experimenting with developing a new type of spout that's special for walnut, correct?
Right. Walnut wood is different from maple wood. And as I said, we've spent 50 years or more developing the technology for tapping maple trees. And then we've taken that technology and drilled a hole in a walnut tree. But it really is very different. The wood is softer, okay? It's not a diffuse porous species. It's a semi-ring porous species. And all these things come into play. So we are working on designing. We haven't gotten it yet. We've got 2nd generation out there and have 3rd generation out this year, a spout specific to the wood density and the depth of the sapwood on walnut trees.
Okay. And that is from what your early experimentation that's helping to increase production?
From our early work, we can increase production with changing the tapping procedures and with a walnut-specific spout. One of the issues with walnut is the thickness of the bark. And so we found that we need a longer barrel on the spout so that we can get it in the wood without actually burying the spout right to the shoulder. So we've increased the barrel length. We are playing now with the taper on the spout. Maple spouts used to be highly tapered in the older days. And if you look at bucket spouts, they still tend to be highly tapered. They've gone to almost no taper in the barrel. And we feel that more taper will seal better in the softer wood of the walnut. But that's yet to be proven.
All right. Gives you something to keep playing with, right?
Always.
And are you putting vacuum onto the collection? Are these bucket tapped? Are you putting tubing and adding vacuum?
Yes, we are. And We have shown that by putting even a relatively low level of vacuum, maybe around 15 inches versus the 24 inches standard on maple, that we can dramatically increase, sometimes double our sap production per tree. And that will make a difference to the viability of a walnut tapping operation.
Mm-hmm. Going back to the sapwood and the internal structure of that tree, does it create that wounding compartmentalization in a tree, much like it does within our maple trees as well?
Yes, it certainly does. It does compartmentalize. It's a very dark compartmentalization. It really turns it into heartwood versus sapwood. And our preliminary work shows that area of compartmentalization is much less, almost up to 1/10 less than you find in maple trees. And we know that walnut trees have a lot of phytochemicals, toxins in them to resist microbial growth, which is why they were used as railroad ties in the Midwest at one time, because they simply didn't rot. And so they're really, really good at sealing off that wound, much, much better than maple, which is good too. Hard maple is quite good at sealing off that wound.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. And it sounds like it could potentially be some interesting novelty wood product. If it has that basically heartwood within a sapwood, you'd be even a higher contrast than what we get in tap hole maple lumber.
Well, as I'm looking at your tap hole maple desk right there, I can see a tap hole walnut desk in my future.
Right. So what does the walnut syrup actually taste like? We're talking about this a lot, but what is the flavor profile?
People that grew up on maple often say that walnut syrup tastes better. So what does better mean? Christoph Herby, one of our producers down in Virginia, has actually got a state grant, and he's doing some flavor profiling in walnut. It tends to be a little mellower, a little more buttery in its flavor, tends not to have, some maple can sometimes have a harsher tone that's modified a little bit in walnut. And as I said, I don't have the specific flavor profile or descriptors in my head, but that will be coming out. And we've got a producer and a researcher who's doing that work.
That sounds really good.
It is really good.
Nice. I want to go back. You had mentioned earlier reverse osmosis a little bit. And so I just want to touch on, are you actually using reverse osmosis, or do you recommend, or?
ROs, interesting topic. The word on the street, everybody's belief is that you can't run walnut sap through an RO, that the pectin in the sap, which is presumed to be pectin, basically will plug up your RO quickly. We did it this year and did not experience that problem. Now, we also learned that this compound in the sap can be spun out of the sap, significantly spun out with a centrifuge. And so what we did this year is we ran our sap through a continuous flow centrifuge that's designed for clarifying oil, waste oil, and then took that centrifuge sap and ran it through an RO, and really did not see any significant problems with that. Now, questions always lead to questions. Would we have been able to run that through an RO had we not centrifuged it? Good idea, but we didn't look at that. We'll look at it next year. Is the centrifuge, in fact, taking out a significant amount of the chemical that's causing the gel in there or not? We don't know right now. Unfortunately, what we're calling pectin is quite hard to analyze for. All right. And we've got a couple different labs down in West Virginia working on this. And I encourage Cornell to pick up the torch and do that as well, because we really need to know more about the composition of pectin, presumably, in our sap and syrup.
Yeah, that makes sense. So thinking about the finished product, are majority of people selling it as just pure walnut syrup and selling it for the top dollar? Or I think I've seen folks who actually combine walnut syrup with maple to sell a maple walnut syrup.
Because you get so little relative to maple, it's more economical to blend it and add value to a maple product than to sell straight out walnut. However, because it's such a novelty product at this point, our producers are able to sell pure walnut syrup or blended walnut syrup. If I was to guess at the sales numbers, I would say most of it is going out as a walnut blend. People know about maple walnut. A 12-ounce bottle of pure walnut syrup cost me $38 this spring. That's pretty expensive to slather on pancakes.
Yeah, for sure. That is a little pricey. If we could get that from maple, that'd be great.
It would certainly change the game. Yeah.
So what are people using it for then? If it's too expensive to slather onto a pancake, what are some of the recommended uses for walnut syrup?
Okay. The people that I know who are buying it, and I don't know all of what they're using it for, some are buying it just as a novelty, to taste it and to share. Here, taste this and taste this, different types of tree syrups. Some are using it in cooking and baking, okay? It can be a nice addition to a cake or a frosting. Some are using it as a sweetener for coffee or tea. You're only putting a couple of tablespoons in your cup every morning. Commercially, I know that you can buy a walnut bourbon. The distilleries, the spirits industry is, at least a number of distillers, are buying walnut syrup and then topping off their bourbon mix to give it a little bit of a walnut flavor.
What about, can you make creams or sugars or candies out of walnut syrup, or it's just too pricey to do any of that?
No, but nobody has tried yet, as far as I know.
Lots of potential. I'm thinking some walnut cotton candy. Sounds kind of interesting.
That would be interesting. Again, nobody that I know is trying it, and I know most of them.
A question I think I've had some folks ask me, and I don't know if the answer is out there, but I'm curious to hear from you, is if for people who have nut allergies, is walnut syrup okay or no?
The answer is walnut syrup is okay. And your predecessor here, Mike Farrell, worked with a university pharmacological lab and proved that. In the boiling process, the protein that is an allergen is broken down. And so even if you're allergic to walnuts, there are no allergies associated with walnut syrup. That was a major question and a major finding when that came out.
Yeah, that's great. That's great to hear. So where do you see the future of the walnut industry heading?
I see more and more people in my part of the world, Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, who are interested in tapping trees and have a walnut resource, getting into the walnut game. I'm sure it'll start out, and it already has started out, as hobbyists. Many people with 4 or 5 or 10 walnut trees, just doing it for fun on some kind of a backyard rig. But then I also see the growth of the industry as farmers who have a more major resource, think about and start making walnut syrup. And the more we can help them, both by sharing the knowledge we've learned about the impacts of vacuum on walnut, about different spouts and tapping procedures, the more successful the walnut industry will become as it moves forward.
Great. Well, Mike, this has been really informative, and I really appreciate you stopping by the Sugar House here at the Uihlein Maple Forest and sharing your knowledge about walnut. I think it's great research that you're doing, and I'm glad that you're doing it because you have access to that walnuts within your area. And as you said, there's great potential for growth. So thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I didn't, but I'm going to send you some walnut syrup, okay?
Oh, great.
And
looking forward to it.
You can share it with folks who visit your Sugar House, and you can tell me what they think, okay?
Great.
So we will make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Looking forward to it. Well, Aaron, it's really neat to hear the work that Mike Rechlin is doing with the walnut trees down in West Virginia. Here in the Adirondacks, we have very little walnut trees, so making walnut syrup is less of an option. But in other parts of North America, there are a lot of walnuts, with great potential for tapping, and especially even in some areas where there may not be any maple available. Down at the Arnott, do you have any walnut trees, or have you ever tried tapping any walnut trees yourself?
Well, sadly, within our sugar bush, we have a grand total of 2 black walnut trees, and they're pretty ugly looking. We've put buckets on them before and gathered a little sap just for fun, really, not for any academic purpose or anything like that. But all around us in the Finger Lakes region, black walnuts are very common. There are a lot of big black walnut yard trees and field trees that would be ideally suited to syrup production because these are big branchy trees with a lot of leaf area. So it's certainly an opportunity in this region.
There's a lot of people plant black walnuts as well for, future timber potential, but could also be for sap potential as well. They're usually relatively fast growing trees.
Yeah, and they have that wonderful property of they release the allelopathic chemical that suppresses other growth around them, which gives them a little growth advantage. And they usually spring up nicely. And there are fields just filled with walnuts in this area.
Yeah, it sounds like there's great potential within that region to start up some walnut syrup operations that may not even be connected with maple operations. There's not a huge amount of producers making walnut syrup, so the market potential, I believe, is there. And it definitely sells at a much higher value, even though you're not getting as much syrup from a walnut tree as we do with our maple trees.
That's right. They do produce less per tap than maple trees. And I believe Mike Rechlin said that his produced about 1/10 of his maple trees, right?
Yes, that's what he mentioned when I talked with him. But I know there have been some other research studies that are finding more around a quarter to maybe a fifth of the amount of production in comparison to maple. So there's still some more data, I think, out there to collect. And it's definitely not as great a yields as maple, but maybe it's not as far off.
Yeah, I think Mike Farrell found slightly better yields in his research. And we don't know as much about walnut trees as we do about maple. So we might find a greater range and variation or, fine tune our techniques for sap collection from walnuts over time. And maybe that number will improve a little bit.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot more research that needs to be done with walnuts.
Yep, walnuts are finicky. And as we pointed out, you don't have walnuts in the Adirondacks. And I don't have many here at the Walnut Forest. But one thing we are rich in is beech trees.
Yeah, there's plenty of beech trees anytime you typically have a maple forest. And so that's kind of my newest alternative tree syrup that I've been experimenting with.
Beech trees were so common 40 or 50 years ago. And as most of our listeners probably know, they were hit by a disease. And it really spread through New York, at least, and then through the entire Northeast through the 80s. And it continues today to impact our beech trees. So only about 10 to 20% of our original stands are healthy, but beech trees sprout from their roots really readily. So when they're infested with beech bark disease, they do send up all these little suckers. So you end up with these 3 to 5 inch diameter stems everywhere. Is that the situation you've got at the Uihlein Forest?
Yeah, definitely. When I say that we have a lot of beech usually within our maple forest, I'm not talking about the nice big 30-inch diameter beech trees. These are these real thickets of beech trees that are just resprouting because beech love to sprout from the stumps or roots. So when those parent trees died off from beech bark disease, now we have all these younger trees that have come into our maple stands and other forests. And so those are some of the trees that I've been looking at actually tapping and trying to provide some kind of product or use out of these trees that are kind of a nuisance within our maple sugar bush.
Yeah, they're a nuisance, but they're right there. So how far have you gotten with your research tapping beech trees?
Yes, I've been tapping trees for the past 3 or 4 years now. So some of the big takeaways that I'm seeing so far is that beech are actually a little bit different from our maple and our walnuts in that you actually need to have vacuum to get the sap from the trees. And so it's not just naturally flowing out through freeze-thaw cycles or root pressure pushing the sap up like in our birch. It's actually the vacuum that we're kind of more pulling that sap from the trees. And also the sugar within the sap, it's not very sweet. It's actually somewhere between 0.5% to 1% sugar within the sap. So our ratio of sap to syrup is, anywhere from 100, 120 to 1 sometimes.
I wonder if part of the low sugar content has to do with the poor health of these trees and if a healthy, uninfected tree might have higher sugar. Have you ever tested an uninfected tree?
I haven't directly yet. It's part of my research plan that I hope to be doing this fall is actually going in and looking at the tap hole closure rate from the trees that I've been tapping the last few years, but then also assessing the beech bark disease on the individual trees that I'm tapping and being able to correlate that with the production of sap that I got from those trees this year. And I'm not sure about the sugar. I didn't be anecdotally out in the field. I didn't witness that myself, but as far as sap production, some of the trees that were really heavily infested with the beech bark disease, it creates these little cankers within the bark and just under the bark of the trees. So that's obviously going to disrupt sap flow in the summer growing season, but wasn't sure how that's going to impact that spring sap flow that we're collecting. But the trees that were really heavily infested did give less sap than some of the healthier looking trees.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question to explore. But I guess the question our listeners really want to know the answer to is, how does it taste?
Yeah, that's a great question. The taste, I like to say, it's actually kind of similar to maple. Some of the flavor notes that I pull from it, kind of raisins or dried plums, dried pears. So it has a nice flavor. It's got definitely unique characteristics to it.
Yeah, I've tried the beech syrup you've made, and I found those same flavor notes, that kind of almost like a pruny, raisiny flavor, but not in a bad way. It was pleasant and it was unique. If you're tapping a bunch of different species and they all taste the same, that doesn't really diversify your product offerings very much. But beech syrup seems to be truly unique. What I'm wondering, though, is how easy was it to process? Could you just run it right through the evaporator, just like you would maple sap?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not tapping a large amount of trees. And so the volume of sap that I'm getting is lower. And also a big thing to say is that the amount of sap that I get from each tree is not a lot. So, they're not producing as much sap as a maple. And that depends on the size of the tree, obviously, just like what we'd expect to see in maple as well. And so when I'm tapping 3-inch and 4-inch diameter trees, I'm maybe only getting a tenth of amount of total syrup, if we look at the finished syrup, as I would from a larger maple tree. So with that, I don't collect enough sap to be able to process through any of our bigger evaporators. And so I'm just using it in a steam kettle, cooking it down. And with that really low sugar, that's going to take forever to boil off all that sap. So I have been processing it using a reverse osmosis this past year, and that really made a big difference in the processing. And so when I use reverse osmosis, I wasn't actually getting pectin, which does create challenges, and especially when it comes to filtering that finished product.
Oh, that's really interesting. So there are some processing issues, and you would have to tap a pretty significant amount of beech trees in order to use a larger evaporator. But I guess the good news is, because beech trees tend to form thickets of small stems, and because they're not going to grow to commercial value, you could really just tap all those little stems and conceivably get a decent amount of syrup, even from trees with like a 3 or 4 inch diameter, right?
Oh, exactly. And because they grow in such tight densities, it usually doesn't take that much tubing to be able to pick up several trees. And so there is, I think, some potential, like you said, even if you've got to tap 4 or 5 trees to equal maybe one maple tree, that's not too hard to get in most forest operations. And so I think there is that potential to tap all those trees and get that sap.
Yeah, definitely. So many possibilities here. And it'll be interesting to see which of these maybe take on a little bit of a life as a commercial product. So we've got maple syrup, of course. We've got walnut syrup, birch syrup, beech syrup. And I guess we'll have to revisit this topic with some new species, but should we leave it a mystery for now? What else we might talk about?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to leave it for now. It'll be exciting to talk about more species in the future.
Okay, listeners can stay tuned, and we'll come back with maybe some surprising new species. We'll see.
Thank you for joining us for Sweet Talk, all things maple with Aaron and Adam. Sweet Talk is produced by the Cornell Maple Program and is made possible from funding from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. All music was obtained from Blue Dot Sessions. For more information on all things maple, visit cornellmaple.com. Join us next time for more Maple Sweet Talk. Have a sweet day.